I won't give another prayer for Steve. Just give the thanks and ask for blessing on the ministry, so that's fine. As he said, I'm going to speak about Solomon. I don't intend to do it all in one session. There's quite a bit to talk about. So my next ministry session was going to be on Rehoboam, Solomon's successor, but I intend now to do two studies on Solomon. First one will be the first part of his life, perhaps early life, and then the second part will be later on. So Solomon's story begins way before his birth in 2 Samuel, when we're told the story of David and Bathsheba, and of how David secretly arranged for Bathsheba's husband Uriah the Hittite to be killed in battle, so he could take her as his own wife. And then in 2 Samuel 12, we're told of Nathan, the prophet, visiting David and telling him that God was angry with him for stealing Uriah's wife. God had delivered David from the hands of Saul and had placed him in a position of power, made him ruler over Israel. He'd given David everything, but still David wanted more. And God was angry with David for his selfish desire for Uriah's wife, and said that he would bring calamity to David's life. David repented for his sins and turned back to God, fasting for many days, and spent a lot of time worshipping God. But God was displeased with David, and Nathan told David that although God had taken away his sins and he was not going to die, he would suffer. And because of his earlier contempt for the Lord, the son that would be born to him would die. But David and Bathsheba did have a son. But soon after he was born, the child became ill. And on the 7th day, despite David's pleading with God, the child died. God was then merciful to David and Bathsheba, and they had a second son, who they called Solomon. His name means peace, and it perhaps refers to God showing grace and mercy towards David after he had repented for his earlier sins. God knew David had truly repented, and he sent word through Nathan the prophet to also call the child Jedediah, meaning friend of God. David must have been comforted by this and assured that his throne would be okay and his line would live on. And it was also a clear sign that God would bless Solomon with special favor in his life. Solomon then was born in about 985 BC. And in 1 Kings 1, we read that some years later, probably when he was about 14, 15, Adonijah, who was one of King David's older sons from a previous marriage, took advantage of his father's old age. David was by now getting old, well, fairly old, middle-aged, we would call it today. And in an attempt to bypass David's right to choose his own successor, he put himself forward to be the new king. Now, Bathsheba, David's wife, found out about this and was upset because David had promised to Bathsheba that her own son, Solomon, would be his successor. So she went to question David about why Adonijah had set himself up as king against the promise that David had made to Bathsheba. And in verses 28 to 30 of 1 Kings 1, we can read, and it says, David is determined to do right and confirms to Bathsheba and Nathan the prophet also that he intends Solomon to be his successor. Now, Adonijah was obviously alarmed at this, and he fled. Fearing for his personal safety, he went away. Solomon sent for him and said that if he showed himself to be worthy, then not a hair of his head would be harmed and fall to the ground. But if evil is found in him, he will die. Adonijah came and bowed down to Solomon, who kept his promise and allowed him to return to his home. Now, this was against all custom at the time. It was more or less expected that when a new king ascended the throne, all potential rivals and threats would be executed. And Solomon had shown a great deal of mercy in his reprieve of Adonijah, and this promised to be a good start to his reign. He came to the throne when he was about 15 years old, and that would have been about 970 BC. His father, David, was still alive, and in 1 Kings 1, verse 48, David said, "Blessed be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has allowed my eyes to see a successor on my throne today." Adonijah's scheming had come to nothing. Indeed, it had led to his own death. And God's plan was to put Solomon on the throne. This reminds us that we should not be pushy or try to put ourselves in places or positions where the Lord has not led us. We must try and accept God's sovereignty over our lives. And if the time and place is right, then God will bless us if he wants it, and will place us in the positions he wants us to be in. David knew that he was dying, and in 1 Kings 2 we read of his exhortation to Solomon to be strong. Therefore, prove yourself to be a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, so that the Lord may fulfill his word, which he spoke concerning me. David wanted Solomon to be strong, because he knew that there would be certain opposition and adversity coming his way. He wanted him to be obedient to what God wanted, especially as God had promised David that as long as his sons were obedient, they would keep the throne of Israel. David then died, and soon after his death, Adonijah reared his head again and asked Bathsheba to go to King Solomon to try to persuade him to give him Abishag, one of David's concubines, for his own wife. Adonijah didn't just want the beautiful woman to be his wife. He wanted to show the world that in taking this widowed concubine of David's to be his own wife, he must obviously have a legitimate claim to the throne. Now, Solomon had been gracious up to this point in allowing Adonijah to live. But if you remember his promise to him, he called Adonijah in again because he knew what all this was about. He knew that Adonijah would eventually try and usurp him and build a claim to the throne. Adonijah had thought the new king inexperienced, young, and weak. But Solomon reminded Adonijah of his earlier promise that if the evil is found in you, you will die. And he paid a hefty price for his deceit and was executed for treason that same day. Early on in his reign, Solomon made a treaty with the Pharaoh of Egypt and others, and he married Pharaoh's daughter, bringing her back to Jerusalem to be with him. She would have been able to see that Solomon had started building a new palace for himself, and also commenced building what was to become the first temple in Jerusalem, as well as many other buildings of importance. This wasn't Solomon's first marriage. It wasn't his last marriage. He was reputed to have over 700 wives, which goes against what we know about his wisdom, really, doesn't it? But he's reputed to have about 700 wives and 300 concubines. We don't get to know the name of Pharaoh's daughter. The only wife we get to know the name of is Naamah, the Ammonite, who was the mother of his successor Rehoboam. Deuteronomy 17 says, that a king is commanded not to multiply horses or wives, nor greatly multiply to himself gold or silver. Solomon failed on all three of these commands. He multiplied horses and wives and gold and silver. He allowed his foreign wives to bring their national deities with them, and he even eventually had temples built to them in his own town. Solomon's wives eventually turned him towards these other deities, and his multiple marriages to foreign women eventually caused a great deal of trouble in his life. These marriages probably made political sense by ensuring he had good relations with neighboring countries and peoples, but they didn't make good spiritual sense. Especially when you think he was turned around from the Lord his God to these other deities. And in 1 Kings 3, we read of the time when Solomon went to Gibeon and offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. God appeared to Solomon in a dream that night and said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give to you." Solomon thanked God for his kindness to his father David, and he asked God for a discerning heart to govern God's people and to distinguish between right and wrong. And God was really pleased that Solomon had asked for this. Solomon could have asked for anything, and God would have given it. He could have asked for long life, or power, or wealth. But instead, Solomon asked for wisdom to be able to govern the people. Solomon returned to Jerusalem, sacrificed burnt offerings to God, and then gave a huge feast to his court. He's famous for his wisdom, and the account of him in 1 Kings 3, settling an argument between two prostitutes about who was the mother of a baby, is well known. The story also highlights the fact that Solomon cared for all his people. It wouldn't have been usual for a king to deal with people of that lowly stature in society, but Solomon cared for all his people. And God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as sand on the seashore, 1 Kings tells us. He was wiser than anyone else, and his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He's accredited with over 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs, and people came from all nations to listen to his wisdom. During his lifetime, the people were happy, well fed, and lived in relative safety in the land. He dealt wisely with rulers of other nations, traded well. Hiram, king of Tyre in Lebanon, sent cedar logs to build the temple, and Solomon sent him back olive oil and wheat, and built a strong and peaceful relation with Hiram. He employed thousands of workers to build the temple, sending them out 10,000 at a time under forced labor regime to cut and dress the stones in the hills for the building of the temple, and then transporting those cut stones back to build it. And even in this forced labor regime, which may have seemed quite harsh, he was wise. He sent 10,000 people away for a month at a time, and then back home for 2 months, so they could rest and be with their family and deal with their own affairs. In this way, he managed his workforce well and was respected as a fair ruler. I'm not going to go into any detail about the specifics of the temple. We've had quite a lot of ministry about the details of the temple, but it was the finest quality that Solomon could build. During the building, God spoke to Solomon and said that if he obeyed all God's decrees, his laws, and kept all his commands, then God will fulfill the promise he gave to David. He would live among the Israelites and not abandon his people. Just like Solomon did his best, we must try also to do our best for God in everything we do for him in our lives. And Solomon did just that. And over the next 7 years, he put back the building of his own palace and prioritized the building of the temple, completed it, eventually bringing in all the things his father David had dedicated, the silver, the gold, the furnishings, and placed them in the treasuries of the temple. In 1 Kings 8, we read about when Solomon gathered everyone at the temple, and the priests brought the Ark of the Covenant into the inner sanctuary. Solomon gave thanks, blessed all the people, and gave a great prayer of dedication. I won't read it now, but 1 Kings 8 has his great prayer of dedication, thanking God for keeping his promise and enable him to build the temple. After the temple had been completed, God appeared to Solomon again and said he'd heard the prayer and plea that Solomon had put before him and had consecrated the temple, putting his name there forever. God then reiterated to Solomon that if he walked faithfully, with integrity of heart and uprightness, obeyed all God's decrees and laws, and kept all his commands, he would fulfill the promise he gave to David, that there would be, his family would always have a successor on the throne of Israel. God also said that if Solomon or his descendants ever turn from him, or do not observe the decrees and commands he'd given them, then he would cut off Israel from the land he had given them and reject this temple. All would ask why God had allowed this to happen, and the people will say it's because they have forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their ancestors out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshipping and serving them. That is why the Lord brought all this disaster on them. There's a similarity here between God's promise to Solomon and Solomon's earlier promise to Adonijah, in that both promises were caveated with a threat of what would happen if things didn't work out. 13 years after the completion of the temple, Solomon also then completed the building of his new palace, and several people visited him, including the Queen of Sheba, came to see him, test him with difficult questions. She was really impressed and left him with much wealth of gold and silver. We're told Solomon was very wise, had a magnificent fleet, a grand palace, traded well with other nations, and accumulated much wealth. However, his greatest accomplishment was to build the temple. He prioritized this over the building of his own palace, and his ultimate mission was to serve God well and his people. The temple was his ultimate ministry to both. His other accomplishments may have been grand, more expensive, more difficult, but the temple was the most important to him. And Solomon's wealth and influence increased over the next few years. 1 Kings 10 in verse 23 says that King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. God loves all those who are interested in his ways and service. He'll give these people everything they ask for. And Matthew 6:33 says, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all things shall be added unto you." We must not be full of ourselves. Even in our place of service to God, we should put him first. We should seek God's will in all things, and then we'll see how much he's going to add to our own lives. Solomon reigned for almost 40 years, until 931 BC. He's considered to be the writer of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, and he was the last ruler over a united kingdom of Israel before it split into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, I'll speak a bit more next time I speak to you about his later life and how his many foreign wives influenced his heart away from the Lord his God and to other false gods. But for now, that will do. It's done about 120 minutes, so that'll do for now.